All right, well, I'm gonna start off here with a little liquid courage. A little shot of tequila in a shot glass that I made. Nice little ocean theme, pretty fun. Hooah. Well, here goes. Maybe I'll cut that, maybe I won't. All right. My name is Alex, and this channel is The Beliefs Bazaar. And I wanted to start out with this video about, what it is to be progressive, or what is a progressive, what it is to be progressive. Now, politically, I would identify as someone who is progressive, but, as I'll get to here, this is, progressive isn't necessarily a political form of government. Rather, it's a kind of a methodology to achieve kind of a direction, or like a direction to take things, to go with policy. Typically, progressives, and I'm speaking for myself here, the form of government that we would like is a social democracy. And what that means is that it is a democracy that benefits the labor, the working class, because we provide the labor that is the wealth of this country. So, progressive is to want to progress to a more equitable society, progress towards a more democratic society. And I did grab a graphic real quick to help with my description of what is equity and whatnot. So here is, let's go back to the bigger one there. Okay. So this is I'll use a different image for the TikTok perhaps in a second here. But anyway, sorry, let me make this bigger so I can read the screen here. Whoops. All right. Here we go. So on the left we have, and I'll skip to the next image here. Whoops. Pew. Okay, the first one is reality. That is, in this reference, there's three people looking at a baseball game. One is an adult, one is presumably a teenager, smaller person, and one is either a smaller person or a child. Now in the first picture, you can see here, the person on the left has a bunch of boxes to stand on so they can see this baseball game particularly well, while the person in the middle has a box so they can see over the fence, and the person on the right has a hole in the ground such that they cannot see or even get close to the top of the fence. The description is one gets more than is needed while the other gets less than is needed. Thus, a huge disparity is created. And the next frame is equality. The assumption is that everyone benefits from the same supports. This is considered to be equal treatment. Now, all three characters are standing on a single box, allowing the first two to see over the fence, but not the third person. They are still too small to see over the fence. Equity is when everyone gets the support they need to, and that produces equity. In this case, the tallest person on the left does not need any boxes to see over the fence. The person in the middle gets a box because that's all they need to see over the fence. And then the small person on the right gets two boxes because that's what they need to see over the fence. And then the final frame is justice, where all three can see the game without support or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. And the systemic barrier has been removed. And in this example, the fence that was blocking the view for one or more of them in the previous frames has been removed altogether. So it doesn't matter how tall or short you are, you can see the game very clearly. So that is I like that example because it kind of gives a pretty good rundown of what it is. what equity, equality, and justice are in that context. So, as a progressive, I would like our society and government to progress towards a more equitable future so that ultimately will deliver justice for the most people. And that's kind of it. I wanted to kind of bring up before I get into this further that what I kind of perceive right now after listening to a lot of, political commentary from across the spectrum is that the largest obstacle to progressive politics is that, frankly, people aren't taken seriously. And that can be any number of things, from being dismissive of individuals or, an identity specifically is what I mean by that. Being dismissive of people that share a certain identity or, are connected to other ideas, through, propaganda most of the time. But ultimately the biggest obstacle that I have encountered when talking to people or even listening to people talk about progressive politics is that there is a big, on the right, the conspiracy is that anything a progressive person says or a liberal says is actually a smokescreen for some, nefarious plan to take over. And then I don't know what. They give answers to what they think will happen once the liberals take over or whatever, and it's all usually pretty dumb and some variation of really intense communism, which I'll get into why that's ridiculous in a moment. But really, though, that is kind of the biggest obstacle, is just that people are told, and they're told that even, like someone like myself who, if you looked into my background, I'm clearly not connected to, name your billionaire liberal or whatever, rich people. I'm certainly not paid by anybody. I don't have a script. I have some notes that I took down. This is all my notes, for what I'm about to get into, which is significantly more than I have here. I don't have a script as given to me by anyone else, and that is a very pervasive belief that I've run into a lot, is that not, even if I myself personally don't think that I'm operating off of this thing, that I have actually become a minion of this whatever movement that is, sounds good as I describe it, or even on paper, these policies sound good, but it's all a smokescreen to hide some more nefarious activities. And I don't know what to say that. I don't know. There's no evidence for that. So I guess my immediate reaction is to be dismissive of it, but I understand that people really believe this. So I don't know. I really don't know. Sorry, I just thought I wasn't recording for a second. That would have been lame. All right. So moving past that, let's just, for the sake of argument, I don't want to, I want everyone to listen to this, so I don't want to exclude people by saying that that is a stupid fucking idea, but that is kind of how I feel, because really you're dismissive of a lot of people who really give a shit, and to just say that, you're secretly plotting to destroy us, or you don't realize that you're working for someone who's plotting to destroy us. Spare me with that shit, really. It's fucking Boro Snoro, dude. Come up with a better fucking argument. If your only argument is to say that you're a liar, like, I need receipts, my dude. Like, it really comes down to that. Like, if you're gonna say that I'm full of shit, I'm willing to be wrong. I just need you to give me a good reason why. And that's it. Give me a good reason why we're wrong. Besides, you think that we're lying. That is asinine. Okay. So moving on. I want to go through this, and I'm really going to try not to get too distracted by the discourse that is out there, Okay, so the thing about progressive politics is like I said, we want to progress, as hence the name, towards a more equitable, more just society for people. And so what does that mean? I am going to briefly discuss my perspective on these. Now, understand, I am not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I blow glass. I work in my garage at my house. I have my own business. I'm not a political science major. None of that. I'm just a normal voter. This is kind of, I would say, I maybe, I spend a lot of time, thinking and looking into political stuff. So maybe I'm just a little bit more educated potentially than the average progressive. But I would say generally, though, in the whole scheme of politics, I am a novice, just your average voter. Okay. So I wanted to talk about what a progressive perspective is on a number of these issues. And I chose these issues from this graphic here. This graphic I just pulled up is as you can see, it's from the Pew Research Center. And this kind of shows what the top 10 issues for voters in this last election were. And the cool thing about this chart is you can see the spread of Democratic voters versus Republican voters and where they landed on these issues. So the top issue, of course, was the economy. 93% of Republicans who voted said that was their primary issue. Percent of registered voters who say each is very important to their vote in the 2024 presidential election. 93% of Republican voters said the economy was their main issue. 68% of Democrats. Now, I think that the Democrats should have maybe paid more attention to that. But anyway, the economy definitely is the main issue, I think, and it should be for everybody. And the notes I had on the economy here, let's see, tax policy and developmental. Okay. The economy. The thing that people want is prosperity. Now, a progressive, I'm not going to, my channel is primarily going to be devoted to beliefs and how they play into, anything really. But specifically the political climate landscape, if you will. So, I'm not going to go that far into specifically what is happening now, but kind of the thing I like to present and the way I like to think about things is, when we have a policy, we want to, I always ask the why and how. So why either is a thing the way it is now, and how does that benefit us, or why make a change from where it is to what you want, and how is that going to help, So those are kind of the questions I like to ask when kind of thinking about any policy. Okay. And so specifically with the economy, I think maybe I'll take another video to kind of delve into the specifics of like where and what, but generally in the economy, we want to have more opportunity for the most people. And also, a couple points that I just want to talk about in this, maybe I'm not going to delve too much into the actual, like, where it's at now. This week, as recording this is the second week of April in 2025. So, there's some pretty volatile, it's pretty dramatic right now what's happening in the economy with the current administration's tariffs and whatnot. So I'm not really going to get into that in this. I'm not personally knowledgeable enough to really say a lot about it, honestly. But generally, progressive economic policy includes some of these following things. Tax policy, of course. There's a lot of talk on the right, especially about thinking back to this prosperous time, maybe the 50s or post World War II, where we had a very big, exponential growth. Our GDP increased a lot. Families were able to, build and have their houses, homes. It was a big time of growth. And that had a lot to do with tax policy. Corporate tax rates were upwards of 50% or more in many cases. And I don't even think that all right. So, personal income taxes, I believe was started sometime before that, but they were very low, in the 50s still, because corporate taxes were so high that, that was enough to fund, kind of the government sponsored programs that provided, subsidies for companies so they could hire and expand, do research, all these kind of things. The money was mostly paid for by corporate taxes. So these are big businesses giving their profits to the country to, grow. And so something that I should caveat real quick with corporate taxes, something that is kind of lost in the weeds, I think, in the last several, at least since I've been paying attention to it, every time tax policy comes up, they talk about how this kind of trickle down economics thing, where if you give tax breaks to the wealthy, then they will reinvest that money into the corporation, into the, research, into their employees and whatever. But the thing that is stupid to me, that doesn't make any fucking sense about this argument, is that if you're a corporation and you make money and you have profits, if you are paying your employees with that money or reinvesting it into research and development, that money is not taxed. Not in the way that corporate taxes are. Like these taxes that they're talking about, corporate tax rate, which is currently 21%, and they want it to be 15%, that is on profit. Okay, not on, they're not being taxed on just income, gross net income, before they are handing out to their employees. So the more they pay their employees, the less is left over to be taxed. Okay, so that is a very disingenuous argument that, giving corporations and wealthy people tax breaks on their income is going to somehow, become more income for the working class. It just doesn't work like that. What would be a better policy would to be, a cap on how much corporate income can be kept as profit, and then the rest must be dispersed amongst employees and R&D and stuff like that. That might not make the top, CEOs and whatever. They might not get, exorbitantly wealthy about that, but the money created by these corporations, which is created by the labor in many cases, and I'm not talking about, there's maybe some financial, businesses or, whatever, things that don't rely solely on the labor of the working class, but most places do. And that's what I'm talking about here. So corporate tax rate is not a indication of how the employees will be treated. It's just not. So I can't read my own notes half the time here. I wrote down developmental investments. Okay, yeah. So those are like subsidies. Currently, people talk about, welfare and things like that for citizens, but they rarely bring up the fact that corporations get the most welfare. They have an obscene dollar figure for subsidies. I'm not going to come with specifics here because I'm just talking about general policy direction for progressive policy. So, you can get, a way to improve our country's, overall well-being, our citizens, our workforce, would be to subsidize developmental investments. So that is like new power sources, that's infrastructure. That's upgrading all our current shit. That is an investment we should be making. That would employ lots of people. And then we all have a better quality of life. Like these are the kind of things that we would have more resources for if we stopped giving tax breaks to the wealthiest of the wealthy And keep in mind, again, like I just said, these tax breaks do not translate to better income and better livelihood for the working class. They just do not. Despite their best efforts to convince us otherwise, Okay. Regulations is another thing that comes up a lot. Now, I would say the most compelling arguments I've heard from the right about why regulations are stupid is because they are, at least okay, so regulations across the board, it's hard. It's not a great idea to just say regulations as if all of them are equal and, whatever. So specifically in this context, most progressives, when we talk about regulations, we're actually talking more about consumer protections, which is to say regulations on big business such that they cannot take advantage of us because we have no power to do anything about it. A good example would be that we should have, I didn't have one off the top of my head. I didn't have one written down, so I'll just have to make one up. Or not make one up, but regulating the finance industry, right? Banks, regulating loans. You can only charge so much interest on a loan, and once a loan is taken, you cannot increase the annual interest thereafter. That would be a good regulation because, a lot of people take out loans and then it has like a sliding interest rate or, compounded interest is a different thing. But, it has a sliding, a non-fixed APR, I guess would be the term. So, a good progressive regulation would be that, there is no, that we have fixed APR. So the percentage rate of the interest on your loan, when you sign the contract for your loan, stays the same, right? It doesn't change for any reason, right? That would be a good regulation. All right. And so I'm not going to go into what all regulations should be, but I will say, the why is to protect consumers. Okay. That's the main reason. You want, I don't know why I didn't think of this, food regulations, right? We want to make sure that there's no, there's below a certain threshold of pesticides still on the food products, right? We want to have, we can't use certain chemicals that have been shown to cause health problems. We can't use certain things in foods, right? Those are good regulations, right? The biggest criticism that I've heard about regulations are that they either are just, extra income for the government because, a company, is willing to pay a fine. The regulations often come in like the consequence for regulations, if you violate them, is a fine or what have you. And such that, big companies work that into their calculation. Like, is it worth us? How much is this fine? Is that fine lower than the profit we're going to make if we ignore the regulation, right? And so essentially, the argument that I'm hearing is that regulations don't have teeth, right? They're not meaningful. They don't have any meaningful consequences such that these companies are motivated to not do the thing, right? And so that to me is just an argument of having more robust consequences for violating regulations, aka consumer protections, okay? And I'm not saying that every regulation is good. Of course, we can address each one individually, and that is progressive politics. Across the board, things are not useful because, it changes in each situation. So, it requires nuance, that's kind of the main thing. We can't just simply say we should regulate this, that, and the other thing because so-and-so fucking thinks it's a good idea or whatever. We actually need to look into these things, decide what this current situation is, how this regulation might change it, and what the result of that will be. So it requires more nuance, right? And more nuance than I'm usually hearing when I hear descriptions of these things. Okay. All right. So regulations with teeth. What are a greater consequence to violating regulations? Well, as people tend to think of in the justice system, if you create a sufficiently negative consequence, that should motivate people not to do the crime. Okay, so what would be a consequence with teeth, as you might say, for a corporation if they thoroughly abuse the population? Well, we could nationalize it, right? And I kind of tend to think that we should nationalize things that could be considered services, right? Like the medical system, for example. Currently, the airline system is such that people are dying because of lax regulations and low standards on safety compliance, right? So these things, these corporations lobby politicians to create less restrictions or lower, less regulations on things so that their profit margins increase, or, they don't have to spend as much on safety. Again, this is another thing where I think, most reasonable people would agree that regulation is useful in certain contexts, right? And so, progressive policy does not say we should regulate everything with the most that we can get away with. That's not fucking useful, or nor is it the argument that people are making. We just want to have reasonable regulation that actually produces the results that we want. Okay, not just a thing that says, if you can afford a $10,000 fine every time you violate some person's whatever, that's not good enough, right? That's kind of that's where we're coming from about why regulation should be or not be, right? There's probably a few other things I could talk about the economy, but that's kind of, I guess personally, I had a few ideas about, because I also understand, like, progressive politics is nuance. It means that we need to not just have an end goal in mind, but recognize where we're at right now and then describe a transition from here to there. Okay, if our current system is this borderline authoritarian thing, right, and we want to have a socialist democracy, we need to describe the transition. Okay, so in this context, the economy, it isn't to say that we need to increase the corporate tax rate to 40% overnight or whatever. No, it's not that. It's incentivized changes. Okay, so if we want to get to whatever, if corporations want to pay 15% fucking whatever, then we need to get to a point where that does not destroy the working class, or that does not have ramifications that we don't want. Okay, so how would we potentially do that? Okay, I had kind of thought of this idea where we could pick a low corporate tax rate, right? Maybe 15, maybe 20%. Okay, but let's just choose 20% because it's an easy to say number. 20%. Okay, well, how do you then take that 20% tax rate on corporations and then allow it to, how does that make any significant positive changes? Okay, well, I had thought about the idea that, we can pick a relatively, moderate baseline corporate tax rate, or even for higher income people. And then you can add a percentage to that is, maybe not a 1-to-1, but correlated or correlated with the poverty level, right? So if the poverty level is 17%, I'll just use a 1-to-1 for the example. If the poverty level is 17%, we add 17% to corporate tax rates, and then and that money goes into social programs that help, build up the population, get them out of these situations that really fucking suck. And I can get into that later because I was homeless for a while and I understand some things about that. So, we could basically create this sliding scale kind of thing to say, well, if we're not investing enough money into the programs that lift people up, get them educated, get them trained, get them into the workforce, if we're not spending enough money on that, then the corporate tax rate needs to be higher, and we'll use that money for that, right? Once these people have established themselves and no longer need this assistance, that unemployment or that poverty level goes down, we can reduce tax rates on the wealthy. That is a reasonable system that would induce the kind of change that we need. You know, if the poverty rate keeps increasing, we keep increasing the corporate taxes. I'm not educated in as many ways as I would like to be, but those people are. I can assure you that if these corporations were faced with the possibility of being taxed upwards of 10% more than they might otherwise, they would create a situation that is positive for people. That is the kind of incentive, right? It is a motivation for these people to do a thing. Okay. So, I feel like I may have left some things out about that, about the economy currently, but, oh, right. The last thing I want to say about the economy. Generally, I actually don't think that people should be taxed on personal income unless your income is solely based on someone else's labor. Okay, so that kind of means that if you are just a general worker and you go to your job, work at whatever, corporation, whatever, and, your labor produces wealth for that corporation, you should not be taxed on that. The corporation should be taxed on the profit they keep, which comes from the labor you create that they keep part of. Okay, and that's what, if you ever heard the phrase wage theft, you should Google that, because that is what's happening right now, is that corporations are ever increasing the margin that they keep. If this right here is the amount of money the corporation brings in and it's not changing, and they pay their employee, their workforce, like let's say 50%, which is actually probably a pretty high number in this current economy. So let's say they pay 50% of their net income to their workforce. Okay. The people at the top, or even the corporation itself, keeps all this profit. That money, that wealth, that, income was created by the work of the employees, of the workforce. Okay. So all the management and the company itself should be taxed on that income that was created by their labor force. Okay. And so labor force shouldn't be taxed on their money. And that's why corporate taxes should be higher and income taxes should be lower if an existing, we can pick an arbitrary number, or we can pick a job description, right? So a management and CEOs get paid out of the wealth generated by the workforce. Okay. So their income should probably be taxed because their income is created by the labor of the workforce. So they should be taxed. And because that taxes goes back into the society that creates their wealth in the first place. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line here, is these rich motherfuckers want to keep all the money that they didn't create. They're just the ownership class, right? They're wanting to keep more and more of the labor that you and I create, the wealth that you and I create. They want to keep more and more of that. I think that is what's causing most of these problems right now. Inequality. Okay, God, this is taking me a long time. I'm just gonna move on now. So the next one was healthcare. Okay, 55% of Republicans think healthcare is a significant issue. 76% of Democratic voters. Now, the thing about healthcare, we talk about this single payer system, and the complaints, I guess, on the right are that, the wait times would be longer, or the service wouldn't be as good, or whatever. Most of the people saying that get healthcare. They go to doctors, they complain about wait times, but they have wait times. You're not understanding that for many, many people, we don't even have that fucking option. And I say we because for most of my adult life, I'm 41 years old now, until 2016, I did not have healthcare. Right? Everything was out of pocket. I didn't go to the doctor really, and so you're talking about some people are upset they might have longer wait times, but you got to understand the other people, the alternative is to not be able to see any doctor at all. So, I could give a shit, honestly, about your fucking wait time as long as the lives of the people that couldn't get healthcare are not just cast aside because they didn't have a fucking whatever, you know? And that is just, you know, looking at it from the current system, right? The way it is right now. If you change nothing else but just allowed for everybody to get healthcare, it would slow it down a little bit. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an overhaul of the system, right? The progressive political direction, progressive healthcare would be to go towards a universal healthcare, so a single payer system where, you know, the collective taxes, again, mostly from corporations, if progressive policy was able to be implemented, it would be paid for mostly by corporations who, again, benefit from your health. So this is not like ambiguous, like, oh, we're just going to pull it from here because we need to. No, that directly translates into their workforce being healthier, being able to work for longer, and having less sick days. You know, it's a straight up benefit to have a healthier population, right? And so the other thing about healthcare, you know, I want to talk about the Affordable Care Act just real briefly, even though, you know, I don't know all of the policy nuances, but I will just say that in its initial form, before it was packed away by all these, you know, lobbyists and what have you, was that it would be a single payer system, and that it would be that because of, you know, there was policies put in place prior to this, you know, because of lobbyists or whatever, that kind of dictated pricing and stuff, or either, you know, and one of the things that I point out to people when they talk about the Affordable Care Act being dumb, or you know, facets of it being stupid, I like to point to the point that, you know, when the Affordable Care Act was being debated and, you know, the language was being changed and all that, one of the things that Republicans would not move on was to, you know, this medication negotiation thing. So if you're on Medicaid, and I'm not sure about Medicare, but because I'm only familiar with Medicaid personally, and I didn't look this up prior to this, but if you're on Medicaid and you're prescribed a medication, you're required to get the name brand medication, not the generic. So Medicaid only pays for name brand stuff. Why is that? They're upwards of like 3 to 5 times, upwards sometimes 10 times more expensive for the name brand medication rather than the generic. Now, if you were on those committees and discussing this thing, and your concern was, how much is this going to cost? Why would you insist on name brand medication? That seems really stupid. And the answer is lobbyists, right? The lobbyists, from the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, had a heavy hand in how that policy was written, such that it, you know, if you want to talk about fraud and abuse, it's the providers. It's not the people receiving medical care. It's the providers who overcharge, and the language of the law that doesn't allow for what am I trying? The medication, the generic medications. Okay, and I know some of that's changed because, well, not really. I'm still forced to get name brand medications when I get prescriptions, but, you know, I don't know. I hear they're talking about negotiating pricing and stuff like that to reduce the overall cost of these programs. But the other thing is just generally like how much medical procedures cost in America. They're inflated prices. You know, if we want to talk about the, you know, maybe we have a more robust, like, you know, more updated technology and stuff like that. But it is significantly more for anything here in the United States than it is for the same exact medical care elsewhere in the world. So that's one of the main problems. If we could eliminate that issue, and then also, you know, basically get real actual pricing and not this inflated thing because they can just charge whatever to insurance companies or the Medicare system, that would reduce the cost of everything sufficiently that, you know, Medicare for all wouldn't even cost that much more than we're currently paying for healthcare in this country. So that is kind of the thing that isn't really discussed when people are talking about progressive policy, we really get hung up on this one payer system, and even Democratic politicians are so, the lobbying money is so just in there that they won't even talk about some of these things because, they'll lose their funding for their next fucking election or some bullshit. It's whatever. But this is not just a problem on the right. This is a problem with every politician, because the system that we have, you can't get to certain, elevated positions without having support financially from all of these corporations and shit. So that is why you don't hear this conversation as the way I'm describing it. Okay, let's pull this graphic real quick. Supreme Court appointments, 73% Dems, 54% Republicans. Okay, I personally, I don't have a law degree. I'm not very knowledgeable on this topic, except for, I think we should have term limits on any position, honestly. But these life appointment things, that creates this, like, the stakes are really high, and if you can get someone in there that's your fucking guy, then you've got, for the foreseeable future, someone that will be voting for you, and voting with towards your policy decisions. And I realize that the Senate approves these nominations. Now, again, to delve into the Supreme Court appointments, you kind of have to step back a little bit and think about the Senate and other things. My thing I wrote for this was money out of Senate and House nominations and fixed Supreme. Okay, so the money in politics is ultimately what creates an unbalanced Supreme Court, because you have obscene amounts of money supporting candidates, politicians, that will be favorable to your policy, right? And then you have those people in positions, and they are influenced by their corporate sponsors to vote for or against various candidates for any position, really, not just Supreme Court, but and I think anyone that was watching the last several presidencies nominations for any position, cabinet positions, Supreme Court, any of these things, these were very partisan people voting on these things, and their motivations included who is going to be the best in this position for our agenda. Not who's going to uphold the law best, but who's going to be favorable to our fucking agenda. And the thing that annoys me a lot about this particular topic is that, the right will claim that any person put forth or promoted by the left is somehow biased and blah, blah, blah. But biased towards what? Liberal policy is good for everybody, and maybe this isn't a place to make that argument, but that's kind of how I feel about it, because liberal policy is inclusive of everybody. And I'll say, this is something that I'll talk about in another video mostly, but when you think about inclusivity, on the right, there's a lot of the propaganda will tell you that the left wants to subjugate you, oppress you, whatever, those kind of things. Well, liberal policy is what's best for everybody, including conservatives. And I'll say from a personal note, I like people. I don't care if you're conservative. What I don't like is the bigotry. You can do whatever you want, man, but don't be fucking bigots, right? Don't be hateful or whatever just because a person is a different identity than you, or because you don't understand their identity, or because they're fucking sufficiently different that you can create this mental barrier between you and them to dehumanize or reduce their standing as a person in your mind. That is what we don't like. And conservative pundits and politicians would have you think that we hate you for being Christian or conservative or any other demographic that identifies with the Republican Party, and that is absolutely not fucking true. We would welcome you if you just stopped with your fucking hate, you know? And that's it. That's the bottom line. So, you know, Supreme Court appointments, term limits. I think, you know, if we fix the problem with money in politics, that would kind of work itself out. So, you know, and also fairness, you know, we had, real quick, we had, you know, back in the days of Obama and, you know, in his administration, you know, Mitch McConnell refused to even allow for the voting of a Supreme Court nomination because it was in an election year. Something that was not as big a concern to them, I guess, when it was Trump in office and an election year. They shoehorned in 2 justices in the last year of his presidency in an election year. And I may be wrong about that. Kavanaugh, I can't remember if that was actually the election year, but Amy Coney Barrett was definitely very close to an election. So, you know, let's have some fucking consistency at least, you know? It makes it seem like really hollow arguments when you have this double standard of like, well, we act this way when a Democrat is in office, we act this way when a Republican is in office. Let's cut the shit, you guys. I mean, really, I get that it works on the base because, you know, their identity prevents them from disagreeing with anything that's presented to them by certain people, but that's another video. All right. So moving on from Supreme Court, foreign policy. And you know what? I am going to have to use the bathroom real quick. So I am just going to cut this out later. Probably not even see this. All right. All right. Back from my bathroom break. Before I continue this, I just want to say I appreciate anyone who's watching this, and you know, I really think that one of the biggest things we all need to do is just communicate. You know, communicate and, you know, believe each other. You know, believe what people say, and you know, most people do not have a secret fucking agenda, right? Most people just, you know, want what's best for their family. I don't know what else to say besides that. That's the driving factor in most things with people these days. Or not just these days, ever, in eternity, in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Sorry, my God. All right. Maybe I should have taken that last shot of tequila, huh? All right, let's go to the next thing here, okay? What do we got? We got foreign policy. All right, and the foreign policy, let's see here. Oh, that's why I had a window projector. Okay. Foreign policy, we had 70% of Republicans think that's a top issue, 54% of Democratic voters. Now, I don't know if I mentioned before where I lean personally on these things, but I think foreign policy is very important. You know, we talk about, or not, we you know, there's some terms, you know, hard power is usually the execution of dominance by military force, or rather, well, just maybe just influence by military force, right? You know, kind of capitulate or we'll bomb the shit out of you. That's a pretty good tactic if you need to get things done. You know, soft power, on the other hand, is economic influence, usually in the form of aid and, you know, economic integration, which I think is kind of the key here. Unfortunately, you know, one of the problems with foreign policy is that we have a bunch of weapons and, you know, material, like military material manufacturers, and they have a lot of money and they have a lot of influence with politicians. And so what that means is that they are motivated financially and otherwise to propagate weapons throughout the world, and also sometimes to use them. You know, like why do we have justification to have all these things if we never need them, right? So, you know, I'm not gonna spend any time right now speculating on whether or not I believe in whatever cause here and there, because I personally don't have enough information to make that judgment. And I think that's also important when talking about these things, is to recognize that you and I, or I don't, you know, maybe not, I don't know if anyone from the Justice Department, DOD, is going to end up watching this, but generally though, whoever's watching this and me personally, I don't think we know enough to make clear and concise judgments about pretty much anything to do with foreign policy, with the exception of the following. I think our goal should be, you know, as has been outwardly said, that we want peace and, you know, prosperity, right, for the most people. Well, that is a lofty goal and an admirable one, for sure. Admirable. But is that how we're actually doing things? I would say probably not right now. Because if that was our goal, I think we would be going about things a little bit differently. And I'm not really going to discuss the current administration in this video regarding foreign policy, because it seems kind of up in the air and a little bit shaky ground right now. So I don't know, you know, I could say something now and then it would change tomorrow or whatever. But the thing that I think we should focus on is humanitarian efforts, not profits. You know, there's resources in other countries that we could use, that we sometimes need, you know, and those things can be acquired without, you know, humanitarian devastation, you know. And I think part of the reason that we don't help out other countries as much as we could is because we haven't helped our own citizens as much as we could. So I think the best foreign policy would start by domestic policy being supportive of our citizens and of our economic strength, because from there we can then go around the world and be like, look, this is, our policies have created this kind of environment, this positive, you know, prosperous environment for our citizens. And so would you not like our help with that? Creating a better environment at home creates a better standing for which we can then say we should have influence elsewhere. If we still have a crazy unemployment or, poverty line, if there's crazy percentage of poverty and stuff, who are we to fucking say anything about how other people should handle their shit? So, I kind of feel like foreign policy starts with domestic policy and, strength. It starts with strength, and that strength is not derived from bullying people around and threatening them with fucking guns. That's just not the way it goes. We should be, that is the way it's been. That is, and, sometimes that produces results, but that also produces resentment. We can think about this in a smaller scale. If you were in a small town and there's a larger town over there, and there's not that many people that live in this small town, but it has a nice community and things are going well, and there's enough to be fairly self-sufficient, right? You can, or at least self-sufficient. You have enough, right? Enough to be fed and whatever. The bigger town over there makes a lot of cool things, though. Things we don't necessarily need, but would be cool to have, right? And so, the best way to go about that, sorry, maybe I'm getting lost in this example, but, the best way you could prosper from a relationship with the larger community is to have trade. You have something to offer, probably, like whether it be like a rural community where you have like agriculture and stuff, and maybe the city or this other area has less agriculture but more technology and stuff. That's a mutual thing. That's where you can mutually benefit from each other's presence, is to have more agricultural products for that other group and more technology for your group. And that can be kind of expounded upon until you get to like countries. When you start being isolationist and being like, no, we're gonna keep what we have over here and those people can go fuck themselves, that creates resentment, because those people over there are just like, well, hey man, we're right over here, like we have the means to like ship you stuff from us, or even just like buy stuff from you. We don't even need to ship you anything. Let's just buy stuff from you, right? The more that you can integrate those two economies, the less motivation anyone has to start some shit. And that's kind of the basis for all of it, right? The more mutual benefit you have from a relationship, the less incentive there is to start shit. So, when we have this kind of policy of cutting off our allies or trying to be like this island of the United States where we don't depend on anybody or whatever, well, other people start thinking like, well, we don't depend on them. We don't need them. They don't need us. Like, what is our motivation to be friendly with these people if they start some shit, right? Like, if the U.S. says, hey, we want to acquire this land, or we want to, extend our influence over here, those people might be like, well, hey, we want a relationship with you guys that's mutually beneficial, but all you want is to take without giving anything, without any concessions, right? I guess back to my example that I was trying to say, which I'm getting kind of lost in, but the example I wanted to say is that, let's say you have a bunch of grain and those people over there don't have any grain, but they have a TV, are you going to say like, I am so, unwilling to just, I'm only willing to deal with the people in my community, and therefore, no TVs or whatever. I don't know, man. I'm getting lost in this analogy, but it really just doesn't make any sense to be adversarial with anybody, really. I mean, what the fuck are we talking about? It's 2025. We have this isn't like tribal communities where we only see the other people that live kind of outside our boundaries like once every now and then when we're both hunting the same herd of buffalo or whatever, or what have you, whatever part of the world, your tribal community lives in, what the animals are. Like, we're kind of past that. We have we can communicate with anyone around the world instantaneously. Like, why are we isolating ourselves? Why are we not just trying to benefit from everybody's input, right? We've got resources over here. We got companies and their technology and their developments over there. We have agriculture and its, contribution over here. We need food. We want different kinds of food, variety of food. There's some things that literally cannot grow here. So what are we doing? What are we doing? Why can't we all get along? Integrating economically is the path to less violence and conflict, and when we create these systems and then just pull the rug out from people and say, actually, you know what, fuck you, we're gonna do things differently, even though we've been trying to cultivate this thing for so long, now we're gonna fucking do something different. It doesn't sit well with people. It's stupid. I don't understand. And clearly maybe there's something that I'm not getting, that if I were privy to the information that the Department of Defense has or the Agricultural Department for the United States has, that I might think differently about this, but I don't know. I don't. As with the information that I have, it doesn't make any fucking sense to me. Why would we want to be so adversarial with people unless, it's ideological. It's, we don't like them for their beliefs, or we don't like them for their color of skin, or whatever ideas we have about that, It seems really stupid to me. I want to be able to accumulate or experience, I want to have access to everything. You know what I mean? Why shouldn't we, in this global economy, have access to anything we want? Why not? It seems stupid. I know a lot, never mind. It seems stupid to be so adversarial in this modern time when we have the ability and the technology to just obliterate those barriers between us. What are we even talking about anymore? I don't know. Okay. Sorry. This is going to be a long video. I'm halfway through. It's an hour in. That's okay. I'm going to post it anyway. Violent crime. 46% of Democrats think this is important. 76% of Republicans think this is important. I think this is very important. I don't know where I'd fall on that. I would have been one of the people that thinks violent crime is one of our issues, but not necessarily in the same phrasing or context that you might hear from the right. Progressive crime policy. Let's go on the what and the why, or why and the how, rather. So I am not going to deny that there's a crime problem, right? To me, violent crime, and this is usually how it's described. I was involved with the legal system for some non-violent offenses when I was younger, but from how it was discussed in that circle, in the legal system at least, violent crime can be considered a person-to-person crime. Assault, sexual assault, injury, or intentional harm to another person. Okay, to me, person-to-person crimes are kind of the peak of what is bad about crime. What is bad crimes? Person-to-person crimes are bad. Obviously, within that category, we have some that are worse. I think sexual assault on children, murder of children is clearly the worst of that. But people can be pretty shitty to each other no matter what the age. So, of course, the innocence of the victim is certainly a consideration when deciding punishment. But as far as I'm concerned, person-to-person crimes are the worst. Now, this is what the kind of disagreement between, I think, the liberal and conservative politics is that, you know, conservatives think that crime is a function of how much consequence and police you have. Okay. Now, and just that some people are bad, and there's some people are just born bad. They're inherently bad. They're going to be criminals. They're lost causes, whatever. All right. On the progressive liberal side, democratic side, we need data, right? We need to know, like, we have the information saying, you know, kind of the causes, what causes these things. And a lot of times it's desperation. You know, I'm not going to say that there's never anyone that wants to be mean or be shitty or steal shit, you know, that just gets kicks out of that. There certainly are those people, but the majority of crime is acts of desperation. And I know because I used to commit them. And I'll briefly talk about that because I was an addict. I was an opiate user for all of my adult life until I was 32 years old, actually, 32 years old. So quite some time. And the crime that I committed was mostly, well, it was never malicious. I'll tell you that. I didn't have revenge or fucking, you know, I'm going to target this person in mind. That was not the case. I mostly stole food and alcohol and things that I could pawn for quick cash to buy drugs, or sometimes even to pay rent. You know, it was usually that I had a job most of the time that I was using because, you know, without which I wouldn't have any money for drugs or to rent, you know, whatever. And necessities. I needed to work because I needed necessities. Now, you know, most of my money would go to paying bills, and then obviously I would spend the rest of it on drugs and then be broke as fuck and then be hungry. So, you know, I will say real quick that, you know, if you have never been hungry or had to survive on a, you know, less than, you know, whatever the base, you know, they say 2,000 calorie diet. So if you've never had to survive on less than you should have for food for any, you know, significant amount of time, you just do not understand the mindset that is developed when someone is malnourished and desperate. You know, if you don't have your needs met, you don't have shelter, you don't have consistent food, you don't have, you know, relationships, you don't have these things, you know, desperation can drive a lot of what we would normally consider to be out of bounds, out of line actions. Okay, so I just want to say that a lot of the crime that we, you know, they're talked about in the context of we need more police are acts of desperation. And if we had better economic policy, you know, a better social safety net to make sure people weren't living on the streets or forced to steal a sandwich so they could eat for the day, you know, no one wants to hire. That was the thing. No one wanted to hire me. I looked like a drug addict. I hadn't showered in however long, you know, I looked like I lived on the street. No one wants to hire you if you're like that. You know, there needs to be, you know, a more robust means to get from there to hireable, you know, and maybe someone took pity on me once and hired me, but I was malnourished and I still made shitty decisions as a result. So I wasn't, you know, longevity in a job was not, you know, not something that I enjoyed, you know, not something that I could rely on because day to day it was so topsy-turvy, especially if my living condition wasn't stable. So, you know, violent crime, I absolutely think that it needs to be addressed, but I think that the way it needs to be addressed has more to do with economic situations and stability rather than people are violent and we need to punish them, right? Okay. Immigration. 39% Democratic, 82% Republican. Now, that figure is relatively low on the Democratic side, I think, because that graph is taken from, you know, people that think it is a priority in context of those other things. So that's not to say that we don't all think it's priority. In fact, I think it's a big one. But that is just to say that I think that Democratic number is on the lower side because it's in the context of those other things. I think if you asked anyone individually, they would think it's important. Now, there's a couple of things that I just like to point out real quick about immigration that is kind of, one of the largest arguments I've heard from the right recently is that Democrats or some group of others, of people that aren't conservative, want to bring in immigrants so that they can change the voting demographic. Okay. Now, that would be a more salient argument if it weren't for the fact that people immigrating to this country who are non-citizens, but here on work visas. So these are, the topic of Social Security numbers being given to non-citizens has come up recently a lot. Now, there's something important to think about that is that, Social Security numbers are given to people with work visas or other, immigration statuses so that they can pay taxes when they work here. Okay. If you were a non-citizen with a Social Security number, but not a citizen, you cannot vote. You are not allowed to vote and you are not allowed to receive Social Security. So all those people that are non-citizen Social Security card holders all came here illegally. You do not get a Social Security number if you are an illegal or rather, if you haven't gone through the process of becoming a legal immigrant here. Okay. They just don't hand those out willy-nilly. And the misrepresentation that, Kamala Harris or anybody is just handing out Social Security numbers willy-nilly is fucking lies. That's just not true. Okay. And while they're, once you become a citizen, yes, you can vote. The path to citizenship is still difficult. And to say that just giving a Social Security number to someone who can pay taxes then changes the voting demographics is patently false. That's a straight up lie. Now, if you are talking about having all those people become full-on citizens, then yes, they can then vote. But would you not want someone who is a full citizen? There's plenty of people who immigrated here legally and became full citizens and are participating, paying taxes, all these other things. Would you not want them to be part of the system? They're paying into it. They're doing all the things. They came here and did the process by which you guys, politicians have, it's legal. It is the way by which people gain citizenship. I don't know what the problem is with that. The mischaracterization of non-citizen immigrants being able to vote or changing voting demographics is just not true. When you get issued a Social Security number and you're a non-citizen but legal immigrant, it says on your Social Security card, not valid for voting. I don't know how much easier it can get than that, how much simpler it can get than that. So the whole immigration problem is generally a mischaracterization of what immigration even is and how that's perceived. It just really seems to be like we just want to be able to kick out any brown people or people we don't like for whatever reason. That seems to be what's happening. And, I disagree with that. Okay. Gun policy. That's a good one. 53 Republican think it's important. 59 Democratic. I think this is also a pretty important issue, but not, maybe not as like, oh my fucking God, as some people think. Now, I don't personally own guns. I don't go shooting. I'm not really part of what people might describe as gun culture. So I am relatively unknowledgeable in this regard as far as what, I wouldn't be able to tell you all of the parts of a handgun. I'm not very knowledgeable. But, I would say, so what did I write here? I wrote robust research into violence and causes and registration and training for, okay. So it's a mischaracterization to say that progressives and liberals want to take away your guns. That's just not true. Okay. What we are saying is that there is a problem in this country with gun violence. And when we say gun violence, we don't just mean shootings, because shootings, although definitely a problem, which I'll get to in a moment, do not even come close to the number of people that are victims of gun violence. And that could mean suicide by gun, using a gun to carry out some sort of violence on another person. So like, again, person-to-person crime using a gun. There's a lot of like children who accidentally, have, accidental access to guns, and, toddlers, whatever, like either injure themselves or another family member because they, didn't know how to use these things. Now, and then of course, the mass shooting issue. So the mass shooting issue, I think, all these things, again, and I even wrote here, if for gun laws, I would honestly consult people who are parts or are members of gun clubs, who are, who actually are involved with these things, right? And I've heard from a lot of liberal gun club members about what they would want for policy, and most of the time, it just includes, we have different types of weapons, obviously, from handguns, single fire operating things, rifles, which are, single shot, sometimes, various, reloading, the guns can reload faster, so or whatever. You have to fucking, whatever. I don't know. Some are semi-automatic. I don't know all the things. Some guns you can modify yourself to make fully automatic. It's whatever. The thing that I think, and this is not just from myself, but from people who are avid gun enthusiasts. But, if you have a weapon, and I think, generally for all weapons, and this should be free, first of all, I just want to say that, first of all, this should be free. Absolutely zero cost, because this benefits everybody. And that is, if you're going to own a weapon, you should be enrolled in a free, provided by the state, gun safety program, training, right? Anyone, we have to do this for driving a car. That's the example. Driving a car is a dangerous piece of equipment if you don't use it correctly. So, we have driver's education and we have a licensing process. I think we should have similar things for weapons. A free, for anyone who wants to anyone who wants to own a gun can go to a free safety course paid for by the state. And that is the method by which you get a license. Okay. Now, there's weapons that are used by the military, which are available to consumers, civilians. And for those weapons, I think there should definitely be a safety training course. If you cannot show that you can be safe and responsible with these kind of weapons, you probably shouldn't have one. But I don't think it should cost you anything to go to these things. I think these should be free, they should be provided, and they should be comprehensive, and teach people how to use them, because that would just, and I'm not a gunner. I probably wouldn't do this, or maybe I would, just so I have the skill set, right? But that is protective of everybody, okay? Not just the people who own guns, have them in their homes, and want their family to be safe from, for themselves even, not just from outside people, but safe in their own home with the weapons. Everyone should have a knowledgeable ability to use and store and everything with these weapons. And that should be free. If you... I am also in agreement of, if you display violent behavior, you probably shouldn't be owning a gun. If you display suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts, you probably shouldn't be owning a gun. Again, I'm movable on these issues, and I think most people are, because personally, again, I'm not as knowledgeable as I could be on this issue. I think we should be talking to military officers, people who train soldiers with these weapons. We should be talking to those guys about what good gun policy should be. Yeah, not up to me. Okay. Abortion. My goodness. Abortion, if you don't want one, don't get one. I am not as knowledgeable on this topic as I could be, or rather, I'm not as knowledgeable on this topic as one would need to be to present policy. So I'm not going to really say much about it, except for the most of the arguments I've heard. A lot of the anti-abortion sentiment seems to be coming from a religious perspective, which again, if you don't believe in abortion, don't get one. You know, I don't think that it should be a law based on your theocratic beliefs. Okay. The other aspect of that is, you know, the human life aspect of it. There's plenty of scientists that have been able to determine, and that's what Roe v. Wade was. There's a scientific consensus determines when a embryo becomes a viable thing, right? It becomes like an actual person, right? Because at first it's just a collection of cells, and later on it becomes a life, you know? So I'm not an expert. I can't tell you where that line is. Experts have decided that in the past, and we even had legislation protecting that. The legislation that is against that removed Roe v. Wade, I think is nefarious, because I don't think it seems heavily influenced by the theocratic perspective, religious perspectives. And that seems to be kind of one of the big, that's where the support came from in a lot of cases. But really though, delving into a little bit conspiratorial here, it really seems like the shift in attitude about this, because it wasn't, religious people weren't always anti-abortion. This was kind of a thing that happened in the 70s and 80s. What I've observed or heard, kind of what it seems like to me is that the anti-abortion movement is more about creating and sustaining a working class, or rather in this context, in modern times, a more destitute working class. So if you remove healthcare options for people who are lower income and other things, and they have a child because they either didn't use contraception, or they, don't have the ability or the legal means to get an abortion. In this modern age, we don't have a sufficient social, safety net, or even like medical, support system to allow for everyone to not be, sufficient, significantly economically impacted by having a child. And it seems like the main motivation behind this movement is just to keep a more destitute workforce, and in larger numbers, such that they can be exploited. And that is kind of seems to be the main drive for this movement currently. Yeah. And so, you know what? If we had a robust support system for people that got pregnant, I might not feel so strongly about. No, that's not true. I would still strongly suggest that we have robust protections for people. Okay, that means any option for healthcare, doctor recommend it. We shouldn't be restricting these things because it makes us feel icky, or we're fucking like have a problem with something, right? Because of our beliefs or whatever. That's not. Your beliefs shouldn't apply to every person, right? We should have the freedom to make these choices between ourselves and our doctor and our family, right? Our personal choice. I thought, it seemed to me like the right was very concerned about, personal liberties, and healthcare is liberty. Healthcare, that choice of how you that is human rights. Women's rights are human rights. And I just, again, these are things that we need to seek out professionals for. And I'll get to, my thoughts on expertise and experience in a few moments here. So anyway, abortion, honestly, I think we should have across the board protections for anybody to exercise their personal health care however they want, and it shouldn't be motivated by economic necessities for corporations, as it seems to be now. Okay. Racial and ethnic inequality. Okay, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning of this. I don't think I did because I was nervous, and this is kind of an intense video. So I didn't mention at the beginning, but progressive policy is to recognize all people, right? Everyone is a person. Are you human? Then you are a person, and you should have the same rights as the next person. That's it. That's it. You should have the same rights as anybody else. Now, I don't know enough to say what, if any, corrective measures should be executed, because currently we have a situation where there is not equality. There is not racial or ethnic equality. So again, the why is because everyone's a person. That's it. Everyone's a person. We should all have equal rights. I've heard from some more nefarious fucking people that, some people don't deserve the same acknowledgement of personhood or humanity. And that's some fucking bullshit. That's some fascist fucking bullshit. That's some bigoted ass fucking bullshit. We can just start from a place of acknowledgement that everyone is a person. We can get rid of a lot of these fucking problems, right? Because really, a lot of the issues that we face in this society is who is more of a person than the other. Who is the they that are after you? For fuck's sake, if we can just acknowledge that we are all individuals having some kind of experience, and that experience is no less or more valid than anyone else's, I think we could kind of cast off a lot of this fucking bullshit. But I understand that we're at a place where, society and various groups have been conditioned for generations to not recognize the humanity in some other groups. And I think if we can just do that, acknowledge everyone's humanity, it would be harder to be discriminative or deny some people rights over others. Okay. Climate change. Big surprise here that only 11% of Republicans think this is a main issue, or a very important issue, and 62% of Democratic voters think it is. Okay. For climate change to be an issue that we need to fix, we first need to acknowledge that it is indeed an issue. Okay, that's why I think only 11% of the right, let's say Republican voters in the last election think that it's an issue because they've been told that it isn't, or that I honestly don't know what, and I've looked into this a little bit, but it's kind of across the board on what do conservatives think that, liberals want to focus on the environment. I don't know why this is so difficult for people to just grasp. I think one of the primary reasons that people have a hard time with this is because they've been told for however long they've been paying attention that this is blown out of proportion, or that this is not an issue we need to be that concerned about, or everyone's exaggerating, or these scientists just want attention, or fucking whatever. Whatever reason you think it's made a big deal about. I think the problem that people have with coming back from whatever position they're at to acknowledging not only is climate change happening, but that human industry, or just humans influence that change in a more abrupt changes, right? It influences the progression towards climate impact, right? Humans have an impact. I think we're there as far as acknowledging that climate is changing, because you can't really, even if you've been alive for 10 years, or even just, I guess, aware of weather for the last 10 years, you can't say it's not changing. Okay, the climate is changing. Whether or not you acknowledge that humans have a significant impact on that or not, you must admit that it's happening. Okay, so and right now we currently have the policy about carbon emissions and stuff like that is kind of it's not helpful because, specifically the carbon tax. And I'll use Tesla as the example because it's easy. Tesla makes a lot of money on carbon tax credits. And they get these credits because we established a system whereby if you are below a certain threshold of emissions, you gain tax credits. And the way the system is set up is that if your company has an excess of these tax credits, you can then sell them to another company so that they can pollute more. So it's not really it's not a net negative on pollution. It's just who pays to do it, right? If you pollute more, you pay more. If you pollute less, you can sell your credits to someone else who can then pollute more. So that's not really that helpful. And especially like the electric vehicle thing, I think is really a positive direction to go. But if we're still creating our electricity for the electrical grid by burning fossil fuels, then it changes nothing, right? We need more robust renewable energy. That's wind, solar, and then developing fusion. A hydroelectric. There's, focusing on renewable energy, the whole climate issue was compounded by the fact that companies like Exxon and BP and these like oil and gas companies put out, they had studies way back when in the 60s, 70s, whatever, about the impact that burning fossil fuels has on the environment. And so instead of, pivoting to another energy source, they just created propaganda to convince everyone that it wasn't an issue. And these environmentalists are freaking out or want attention or fucking this, that, and the other thing. So if you think that climate change is not caused by humans and that burning gas ad nauseum is fine and the earth can just kind of reabsorb it or fucking it just dissipates the pollution or whatever, you are a victim of propaganda by the fuel and the gas and oil industry. And that's forgivable because, how could we not? It's difficult and requires effort to not be swayed by these things. Okay. So yeah, that was the last one on this list here was climate change. So those are the biggest issues as described by voters in this last election cycle. I'll add my biggest concern. Now, when I say biggest, I don't necessarily mean that it trumps the economy or healthcare or some of these other things. But I think that it is pivotal to create a better outcome for all of those other things, right? And that's education. Education is paramount. And, I recently, I looked into this a little bit, and upwards of 50% of the American population has a 6th grade or lower reading level. Now, that typically, when they say 6th grade or lower reading level, that includes comprehension, because, you know, when you're at like a high school, you're, you know, like maybe not freshman, but by the time you're finished with high school, you should have an adult reading level and comprehension, meaning that you have the vocabulary to read, you're capable of reading, of course, literacy, but you're also capable of comprehending adult material and adult content, or nuanced content, if you will. And so if you only have a 6th grade reading and comprehension level, you know, I'm sure people have met 6th graders. I don't know how old that is. What is 6th grade? If high school is 18, you graduated 18. So that's like 12-year-olds, right? 12-year-old. Most 50% of adults in this country do not have a higher reading and comprehension level than a 12-year-old if you're in public school. Now, I don't know how 50% of the population with this 12-year-old reading level is supposed to approach these nuanced, important economic and otherwise problems. How are you going to fucking do that? And so, you know, the thing that, you know, there's a lot of pushback in education now about woke and fucking whatever that means, which actually I'm going to make another video about wokeness and what is woke and anti-woke. But, you know, these things they're saying, like, we don't want to indoctrinate children with blah, 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 or whatever. And that is just not the fucking case. You know, indoctrination happens when you refuse to let someone experience or intake information outside of a specific thing, right? I won't get into what that actually is, but, you know, teachers aren't going in there trying to turn people fucking trans or anything. That's stupid. They're trying to fucking give your children, and I don't have any children, but I went to school, so I understand the concept, and I you know, I'm very knowledgeable about what education is, you know. So, you know, that education, or there used to be when I was younger, education is power. Education allows you to, you know, how can you make any good decisions if you don't have all the facts, right? You want to decide if you want to buy a car. You need to think about your income, your expenses, and how much you can afford, right? That is just a basic example of how education is required. You need to educate yourself on those things to make the good decision, right? And how can you make a good decision about how society should be if you don't know anything about it? If you don't know any history, you don't understand the ramifications of economic decisions, you don't understand foreign policy and how that affects people. I didn't mention it in foreign policy, but like it's closely tied with immigration. Our foreign policy, how well other countries are doing, and whether or not their economics are stable or not, dramatically affects the influx of immigration, right? If we created a robust safety net for ourselves and our citizens and created a better standard of living, a bottom line whereby which we do not let anyone fall below some level of basic decency, right? We can then say that should be the case in other countries, and we can help them achieve it, and then people would be comfortable. We wouldn't have people needing to immigrate because they only want a better future for their family. And that is the vast majority of this immigration that people are demonizing. All these people coming here, but you know, just to like, they say they're coming here to just like, you know, feed, you know, take our resources and take our welfare and live off of this and that and the other thing. That's not how it fucking works. You cannot get welfare if you are not a citizen. You cannot get, and I don't mean across the board. There are certainly, you can get SNAP and stuff like that, but you also have to be here, and you're in the community, you're participating in the community, and whether or not, you know, you're paying a lot of taxes towards a thing, you're spending money in the community. People still have to eat. People still have to live. They need clothing. They need a place to stay. That supports our economy. That is feeding back into the economy. Whatever money they make, they spend here, right? And they might send some back home, but that's because their economic situation is not good. It's unstable. If there was stability in other countries, we wouldn't have as many people immigrating here. And when they do, it would be because they're seeking out higher education, or they're here for jobs. They want to contribute to our society or the global society with their educated skills, right? We can help other countries do that if we first help ourselves achieve some baseline of standard for how we want our citizens to be, right? Do we want 50% of our adult population to have a 12-year-old reading level? Come on. What are we fucking doing, man? I mean, really, like, are we letting our fucking bigotries and prejudices so thoroughly rule us that we can't even do what's best for ourselves? That's what's happening. People are choosing the bad choice because because a liberal cries, or I'm really sticking it to the immigrants. Meanwhile, I'm preventing my own state from having the social safety net that's required for if my neighbor has a hard couple months and they need some kind of assistance. If I can't help them, they should be able to get that, right? They're hardworking. They're one of their relatives is sick or in the hospital. They don't have health care. What the fuck? We're not talking about people coming here from other countries to soak up our fucking, if we even allow them to take our resources. We're talking about just providing a basic level of fucking, of a standard of decency for humans. Forget anything else. They're humans. Are you a human? How do you want to be treated? Think about that when considering any other person. Forget any other detail about them. They are a fucking person and should be treated as such. That is progressive politics right there. Everybody should be treated as a person. And, again, I'm not knowledgeable enough to know how the transition should happen from where we're at to where I think and many think we should be. But that transition is it. I mean, this is another thing that kind of gets lost in the sauce is these incremental steps. People want to see the results immediately. Well, we're not just creating a society from nothing all of a sudden today. Right? We have to acknowledge where we're at and where we need to get to, or where we want to get to, and what are the steps needed in between. That's kind of it. That is progressive politics. Choosing a goal and figuring out the best way to progress there. And the only way you can do that is to understand the nuances of what is happening and what it actually takes to get to our goal. All right. That is progressivism in a nutshell from me, someone who is not an academic. So honestly, if any of that was interesting or you think that I'm wrong, like I said earlier, I'm willing to be wrong. I just need a good reason about why. Why am I wrong? So, that's usually my MO when I seek out these kind of things, when I look into policies and stuff. If I have a feeling about the way it should be, I try to understand how that could be wrong and then pivot to a more correct methodology of achieving my goal. And yeah, that's it. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much. This is kind of my first major video on this channel. It might even be the first one I post, depending on, a couple other videos I'm recording concurrently. So, I really appreciate people checking this out. I don't do this professionally. I blow glass as a hobby, or not a hobby, but as my career path, I suppose. I occasionally work a side job for supplementary income, but I'm a craftsman by trade. So I'm not a political scientist. I don't have any political degree or otherwise, but I just know that people who are progressive like myself give a shit and we really care about these things. And we also try not to make rash decisions. So I understand why sometimes progressive policy can be seen as kind of flimsy or not as consistent as some things that we've just, for example, conservative politics doesn't vary much. Like they picked a thing 50 years ago and they have yet to modify that. Well, I can see why progressive politics might not appeal to someone who needs such a concrete thing to point at, because progressive politics changes based on where we're at and where we want to be, right? We collectively can say, hey, maybe this goal we had 20 years ago isn't appropriate anymore because we either have achieved it in the most meaningful way possible, or it's just not realistic anymore. And I don't have any specific examples, but, because I wasn't around back then really, but, the goals for future economy in the 70s will differ greatly from now because we have technology. The technology that we have from then and now is so different that needs to be taken into account. So antiquated policies from back in the day are only as useful as they are as a stepping stone to where we want to go from, And I think that, again, that can seem like it's not a consistent thing, but it is consistent in that we have values that we want to achieve, right? Equality, equity, right? These are values that we need to retain and hold on to during this whole thing. So we approach the situation focused on equity and prosperity, and we take an accurate reading of what the situation is now and how it has been and what things changed what and how. And then from there, we can present a policy towards the goal that we want. And that isn't always going to be the same at every instance. It might change from, if my goal is to get from today to tomorrow, that's going to look different from next Tuesday to the next Friday, And so we need to acknowledge that this is a dynamic system. And as such, we should have dynamic goals. That's it. Thank you for watching. My name's Alex. This is the Beliefs Bazaar. Thanks so much. Definitely cut that. Hi, Shane. Woo. My goodness. Woo. Whew. All right. All right. Wow. I just took another shot and that did not go down well, but it's good. I'm good. All right. Thank you for joining me on this video. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, but if you're listening to this ramble, if you're listening to me ramble this long, I appreciate it. And